In the eyes of a gardener, compost is worth its weight in gold. It's something that's easy to make, and with a little patience, you can have that black gold in your garden within a few months. Hello, I'm Richard Parrish. I'm the County Extension Agent for Agriculture and Natural Resources in Leon County. And today I want to visit with you and encourage you to begin making your own compost for your landscape and gardening needs. There are many benefits to making and using compost in your garden and landscape. Plants need less water when they're treated with compost. Compost provides a slow-release source of nutrients for the plants. This is a type of fertilizer, slow-release fertilizer. Compost reduces the amount of waste entering the landfill. Compost can increase the water-holding ability of a sandy soil, and in Leon County we have a lot of sandy soils. So by adding compost to our sandy soils, it helps that water to stay in our soil longer, thus benefiting the plant. And if you have a heavy clay soil, compost can help loosen that heavy clay soil. So there's many benefits to using compost. Well, how do I go about making a compost pile? What are the steps that I need to take? Well, step one is you need to find a spot to set up your pile. You want to make sure that where you set your pile that you avoid direct sunlight. Yes, you'll need some sunlight, but you want to avoid direct sunlight. So maybe think about putting it in a spot that gets a little bit of shade as well. You want to avoid floodable areas. If it's a low spot in your property, or if it's a spot that likes to flood whenever it rains, you might want to avoid using that spot to put your compost bin. If you've got an area that has bare soil as a base, that would be an ideal area to put your compost bin. But also, as you're thinking about where to put your pile, you want to be mindful of large critters such as snakes and mice and raccoons. They're going to be attracted to some of the food and insects that might be living in and around your compost pile. So you might not want to put it close to the house. You might want to have it some distance from the house just because of the critters that the compost pile could attract. You want to make sure that the compost pile is easily accessible. You're more likely to add material to the compost pile and actually use the compost if it is easily accessible. And finally, you want to make sure that your compost pile or your compost bin is within reach of a water hose, because you will be needing to add water to get the compost process started. So you want to make sure that it's within reach of a water hose. Well, once you have found your spot, step two is to determine your method of composting. And you're going to determine your method of composting based upon several factors. One might be your budget. How much do you have to invest in a compost pile? How much space do you have available? What type of effort are you wanting to put in? Are you wanting to just throw some materials in every now and then, or are you looking to put a lot of work and sweat equity into your compost bin? What are you going to be feeding your compost? What's your feedstock? Is it going to be leaves? Is it going to be grass clippings? Is it going to be vegetable and food waste? What's the feedstock going to be? And then two, how do you intend on using your compost? So think about all of those whenever you are designing or whenever you're trying to determine your method of composting. And that is going to determine too what type of bin you use. Now, you don't have to go all expensive and fancy with a compost bin. With this compost bin here, they've taken some fallen logs, made a perimeter or made a frame out of the fallen logs, and they are adding their leaf debris, their vegetable scraps to the inside of their compost bin, which in this case is fallen logs laid directly on the ground. So this is one method of composting. Another method is taking some fencing wire and rolling it such that you have a circular cylinder, about 3 foot in diameter, securing the wire so that you maintain the shape of your cylinder, and putting that where you want your compost bin. So that's another acceptable method of composting. Maybe you've got access to some wooden pallets. You can secure those wooden pallets in such a way that by using the 4 wooden pallets, you have the sides of a compost bin. So you could certainly use wooden pallets to make your compost bin. Maybe you want to go a little bit more fancy and something maybe a little bit more eye-appealing depending upon the look of your landscape. So you can certainly invest in some compost bins made out of 1x4, 1x6, 1x8 materials. Also using some hardware cloth to allow for some ventilation. And so this is a 3-bin system. Or if you really want to go fancy and make an investment, you can certainly buy a compost tumbler or make a compost tumbler, and that's another method of composting. So there's a wide variety of composting methods. So depending upon what your intent, what your budget is, the space you have is going to help determine what method you will use. Well, once you have your method identified, you want to layer your pile. This is where you're going to start putting material into your pile. So at the bottom of your pile, you want to put a layer of sticks at the bottom, and that's going to help with drainage and airflow through your compost. You want to make sure that you have good drainage, because as it rains or as you add water, in order to help boost the microbial action in your compost, that water needs a place to go. Airflow is going to help keep oxygen in the compost. It's going to help to keep the microbes with the adequate oxygen to help keep the smells down, and that's going to help with the decomposition process. And with your piles, you're going to add a layer of browns, and that's your carbon material, and you're going to add layers of greens, and that's going to be your nitrogen. So you want to make sure that you have a layer of brown, a layer of greens, and make sure you cover those greens with a layer of brown. And as you go along, it's always a good idea to water those layers as you get them in, to moisten those layers to keep adequate moisture in there. And you want to make sure that you cover your pile with a lid to keep the moisture and the heat in. And by a lid, that's simply a layer of browns put on top to help keep that moisture and heat in your compost bin. As a general rule for composting, you want to have a carbon to nitrogen ratio of about 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. Also, you want to make sure that you incorporate oxygen and water into your compost bin. That's very important. It's going to help with the microbial action, the microbial life that's in your compost bin, and help with the composting process. Avoid meat and dairy products in your compost bin. Do not put in meats or dairies. Also, in order to get adequate heat in your compost bin, you want to have a pile that's at least 3 foot long by 3 foot wide by 3 foot deep. That will help to ensure that the compost bin will heat up to a healthy temperature. And also, you want to make sure that you turn your pile every few weeks to redistribute the materials and to redistribute the microbes that are breaking down that organic material in your compost pile. Well, what can be added to a compost pile? We talked about greens and we talked about browns, with those greens being the nitrogen sources and the browns being the carbon sources. Well, some browns that you might add to your compost bin include dried leaves, hay, newspaper, straw, tree bark, wood chips, shredded paper. Those would be items that you would consider your carbon sources or your browns. Some of your nitrogen sources or your greens would include coffee grounds, fruits and vegetables, grass clippings, kitchen scraps, tea bags, eggshells, and animal manures. Try to avoid dog and cat, some of those pet manures, just because of the base of their diet. There's a lot of meat and protein in there, which could lead to some foul smells. So if you're using animal manures, go for the cattle manures, the sheep, the rabbit manures, the horse manures, but stay away from dog and cat manures. So after you have your compost bin, keep it moist, keep it turned every so often, then you can harvest your compost. The harvesting method is going to depend upon how the composting method. So you might be able to shovel it straight into a wheelbarrow or a bucket for use, or you might have to actually screen or sift out your compost. But your compost is ready when there is no more ammonia smell. You go to your compost and you stick your hands in it, and you're going to have a nice earthy smell. Also, you want to squeeze. You can use the squeeze test to determine the moisture content. You don't want it too wet. You don't want it sopping wet, but yet you don't want it dry either. Whenever you squeeze a handful of compost, it should be moist such that it just lightly sticks together. And you want to make sure that your compost is done, is cured. You want to avoid gardening with premature compost or compost that isn't quite ready because of the lower pH of the acidity in that premature compost. It can burn your plants. So while you think, oh, I'm adding compost to my garden, I'm doing all the good, if your compost is not cured and ready, you can actually do more harm than good. And as I said, you might want to screen your compost, especially if you're going to be using it for seedlings. So you can screen your compost by putting it through some sort of sifter or piece of hardware cloth in order to get out some of those larger chunks that might not have broken down in the composting process. And then step 5, garden. Add that compost to your garden. Side dress plants with it as you're incorporating or planting plants in your garden. Add that compost to those planting holes, and that compost is going to provide that source of nutrition for your gardens. And so use that compost for the benefit of your garden. If you'd like more information on composting, or if you'd like more information on tips to help your garden grow, contact the Leon County Extension Office. You can either come to the office. We're located at 113 West Main in Centerville. We're on the 3rd floor of Leon County Annex 1. You can log on to our website at leon.agrilife.org, or you can give us a call at 903-536-2531.